Holes. Yesterday, when we read, Zero ran away because he's sick of everybody telling him that he's stupid, as he should be. Everybody's being super rude to him. So he ran away. Nobody's seen him. And then the warden and Mr. Sir and Mr. Podansky come to Stanley and they say, have you seen him? Do you know where he is? And Stanley says, I haven't seen him. And they said, basically, we're just going to erase him, pretend like he was never here. If anybody asks, we have no idea who he is because nobody cares about him. Nobody is going to come looking for him. So we'll just pretend like we have no clue where he is. Kind of rude, right? Let's see what happens next. Chapter 32. 2 days later, a new kid was assigned to Group D. His name was Brian, but X-Ray calls him Twitch because he was always fidgeting. Twitch was assigned Zero's bed and Zero's crate. Vacancies don't last long at Camp Green Lake. Twitch had been arrested for stealing a car. He claimed he could break into a car, disconnect the alarm, and hotwire the engine all in less than 1 minute. I never planned to, steal one, he told them. But sometimes, I'd be walking past a real nice car parked in a deserted area and, I'll just start twitching. And if you think I twitch now, you should see me when I'm around a car. The next thing I know, I'm behind the wheel. Stanley laid on his scratchy sheets, and it occurred to him that his cot no longer smelled bad. He wondered if the smell had gone away, or maybe he'd just gotten used to it. Hey, caveman, said Twitch. Do we really have to get up at 4:30 a.m.? You get used to it, Stanley told him. It's the coolest part of the day. He tried not to think about Zero. It was too late. Either he'd made it to Big Thumb, or... What worried him the most, however, was that it was too late. What worried him the most, however, wasn't that it was too late. What worried him the most was what really ate at his insides. It was the fear that it wasn't too late. What if Zero was still alive, desperately crawling across the dirt, searching for water? He tried to force that image out of his mind. The next morning, out on the lake, Stanley listened as Mr. Sir told Twitch the requirements for his hole. As wide and as deep as your shovel. Twitch fidgeted. His fingers drummed against the wooden shaft of his shovel, and his neck moved from side to side. You won't be twitching so much after digging all day, Mr. Sir told him. You won't have the strength to even wiggle your pinky. And he popped some sunflower seeds into his mouth, deftly chewed them, and spat out the shells. This isn't a Girl Scout camp. The water truck came shortly after sunrise, and Stanley got in line behind Magnet, ahead of Twitch. What if it's not too late? Stanley thought. He watched Mr. Sir fill X-Ray's canteen. The image of Zero crawling across the hot, dry dirt remained in his head. But what could he do about it? Even if Zero was somehow alive after more than 4 days, how would Stanley ever find him? It would take days. He'd need a car. Or a pickup truck. A pickup truck with a tank of water in the back. Stanley wondered if Mr. Sir had left his keys in the ignition. He slowly backed away from the line and then circled over to the side of the truck. He looked through the window. The keys were there, dangling in the ignition. Stanley felt his fingers start to twitch. He took a deep breath to steady himself, and he tried to think clearly. He had never driven before, but how hard could it be? This is really crazy, he told himself. Whatever he did, he knew he'd have to do it quickly before Mr. Sir noticed. It's too late, he told himself. Zero couldn't have survived. But what if it isn't too late? He took another deep breath. Think about this, he told himself. But there wasn't time to think. He flung open the door to the truck and climbed quickly inside. Hey, shouted Mr. Sir. He turned the key and stepped on the gas pedal, and the engine revved. But the truck didn't move. He pressed the pedal all the way to the floor. The engine roared, but the truck was motionless. Mr. Sir came running around the side of the truck. The door was still open. Put it in gear, shouted Twitch. The gear shift was on the floor next to the seat. Stanley pulled the lever back until the arrow pointed to the letter D for drive. The truck lurched forward, and Stanley jerked back against the seat and tightly gripped the wheel as the truck accelerated. His foot was pressed all the way to the floor. The truck went faster and faster across the dry lake bed. It bounced over a pile of dirt, and then suddenly Stanley was slammed forward and then instantly backward as the airbag exploded in his face. He fell out of the open door and onto the ground. He had driven straight into a hole. He lay on the dirt staring at the truck, which stuck lopsided into the ground. He sighed. He couldn't blame his no-good, dirty, rotten, pig-stealing great-great-grandfather this time. This time, it was his own fault. 100%. He had probably just done the stupidest thing he had ever done in his short and miserable life. He managed to get to his feet. He was sore, but he didn't think he had broken any bones. He glanced back at Mr. Sir, who remained where he was, staring at Stanley. He ran. His canteen was strapped around his neck, and it banged against his chest as he ran, and every time it hit against him, it reminded him that that canteen was empty, empty, empty. Chapter 33. Stanley slowed to a walk. As far as he could tell, nobody was chasing him. He could hear voices coming from back by the truck, but he couldn't make out the words. Occasionally, he'd hear the revving of the engine, but the truck wasn't going anywhere anytime soon. He headed in what he thought was the direction of Big Thumb, but he couldn't see it through the haze. Walking helped calm him down and allowed him to think clearly. He doubted that he could make it to Big Thumb, and with no water in his canteen, he didn't want to risk his life on the hope that he'd find refuge there. He'd have to return to camp. He knew that. But he was in no hurry. It would be better to return later, after everyone had had a chance to calm down. And as long as he had come this far, he might as well look for Zero. He decided that he would walk as long as he could until he was too weak to go any farther, and then he'd turn around and go back. He smiled as he realized that that wouldn't quite work. He would go only halfway as far as he thought he could go, so that he'd still have the strength to return. And then he'd have to make a deal with the warden, tell her where he found Kate Barlow's lipstick tube, and then beg for mercy. He was surprised by how far out the holes extended. He couldn't even see the camp compound anymore, but he kept on passing holes. Just when he thought he'd passed the last hole, he'd come across another cluster of them, a little farther away. Back at the compound, they had dug in a systematic order, row upon row, allowing space for the water truck. But out here, there was no system. It was as if every once in a while, in just a fit of frustration, the warden would pick a spot at random and say, "What the heck, dig here." It was like trying to guess the winning numbers in a lottery. Stanley found himself looking down into each hole he passed. He didn't admit to himself what he was looking for. After more than an hour had gone by, he thought he had surely seen the very last hole, but then off to the left, he saw another cluster of them. He didn't actually see the holes. He saw the mounds of dirt that surrounded them. He stepped over the mounds and looked into the first hole, and his heart stopped. Down at the bottom was a family of yellow spotted lizards. Their large red eyes looked up at him. He leapt back over the mound and ran. He didn't know if they were chasing after him. He thought he might have seen one leap out of the hole. He ran until he couldn't run any farther, and then collapsed. They hadn't followed him. He sat there a while and caught his breath, and as he got back to his feet, he thought that he noticed something on the ground, maybe 50 yards away. It didn't look like much, but maybe just a big rock. But in a land of nothingness, any little thing seemed unusual. He walked slowly toward it. The encounter with the lizards had made him very cautious. It turned out to be an empty sack of sunflower seeds. He wondered if it was the same one Magnet had stolen from Mr. Sir, although that didn't seem likely. He turned it inside out and found one single seed stuck to the burlap. Lunch. One more chapter. Chapter 34. The sun was almost directly overhead. He figured that he could walk for no more than another hour, maybe 2, before he'd have to turn back. It seemed pointless. He could see that there was nothing ahead of him. Nothing but emptiness. He was hot, he was tired, he was hungry, and most of all, he was thirsty. Maybe he should just turn around now. Maybe he'd already gone halfway and he didn't even know it. Then, looking around, he saw a pool of water less than 100 yards away from where he was standing. He closed his eyes and opened them to make sure he wasn't imagining it. The pool was still there. He hurried toward it, but the pool hurried away from him, moving as he moved, stopping where he stopped. There wasn't any water. It was a mirage caused by the shimmering waves of heat rising off the dry ground. He kept walking. He still carried the empty sack of sunflower seeds. He didn't know if he might find something to put in it. After a while, he thought that he could make out the shape of the mountains through the haze. At first, he wasn't sure if this was another kind of mirage, but the farther he walked, the clearer they came into view. Almost straight ahead of him, he could see what looked like a fist with its thumb sticking up. He didn't know how far away it was. 5 miles? 50 miles? One thing was certain. It was way more than halfway. He kept walking toward it, although he didn't know why. He knew he'd have to turn around before he got there. But every time he looked at it, it seemed to encourage him, giving him the thumbs up sign. As he continued walking, he became aware of a large object on the lake. He couldn't tell what it was, or even if it was natural or man-made. It looked like a little fallen tree, although it didn't seem likely that a tree would grow right here. More likely, it was a ridge of dirt or rocks. The object, however, whatever it was not on the way to Big Thumb, but off to the right. He tried to decide whether to go to it or to continue toward Big Thumb, or maybe he should just turn around. There was no point in heading toward Big Thumb, he decided. He would never make it. For all he knew, it was like chasing the moon. But he could make it to that mysterious object. He changed directions. He doubted that it was anything, but the fact that there was something in the middle of all this nothing made it hard for him to pass up. He decided to make the object his halfway point, and he hoped that he hadn't already gone too far. He laughed to himself when he saw what it was. It was a boat, or part of a boat anyway. It struck him as funny to see a boat in the middle of all this dry, barren wasteland. But after all, he realized, this was once a lake. The boat lay upside down, half buried in the dirt. Someone may have drowned here, he thought grimly, at the same spot where he could very well die of thirst. The name of the boat had been painted on the back. The upside-down red letters were peeled off and faded, but Stanley still could read the name. Mary Lou. On one side of the boat, there was a pile of dirt, and then a tunnel leading down below the boat. The tunnel looked big enough for a good-sized animal to crawl through. He heard a noise. Something stirred underneath the boat. It was coming out. "Hey!" Stanley shouted, hoping to scare it back inside. His mouth was very dry, and it was hard to shout very loudly. "Hey," the thing answered weakly. Then, a dark hand and an orange sleeve reached up out of the tunnel. I'm stopping there. I know it's a cliffhanger, but we will read some more next week. Stay tuned.